There comes a moment in therapy that feels less like a session and more like an exorcism of illusion. The day a therapist sees, names, and confronts the full architecture of narcissistic pathology. This isn't just about a difficult personality or painful relationship dynamics. It's about the disintegration of self, the quiet colonization of identity by a false construct designed to manipulate, dominate, and survive at any cost. For the person entangled with such pathology, whether as a partner, a child, or even the narcissists themselves, the experience is not merely turbulent. It is a slow suffocation of the soul, a life lived in psychological captivity under the rule of a personality structure that feeds on attention and punishes authenticity. It is not merely emotional volatility, it is identity confusion, manipulation, and emotional imprisonment masquerading as connection. In cases of pathological narcissism, especially as outlined in Otto Kernberg's theory of borderline personality organization, we are not dealing with occasional arrogance or self-absorption. We are confronting a deep, structural distortion of the self, built upon defenses so rigid and pervasive that reality itself becomes warped in service of the narcissist's internal needs. And for those who have loved or treated such individuals, this disorder leaves wounds that reach beyond the personal into the spiritual. Exposure as the beginning of clinical clarity. Therapeutic clarity begins when the mask begins to crack. For Kernberg, the narcissist operates with a false self, a grandiose, idealized version of themselves created to protect against deep-seated feelings of emptiness and shame. This false self isn't just a facade, it's a psychological survival mechanism. And at first, it works. The narcissist often presents as magnetic, successful, even admirable. They may appear to possess extraordinary confidence, strength, and insight. But as the therapeutic relationship deepens, the incongruities start to show. The patient may begin to contradict themselves, show inappropriate emotional responses, or exhibit manipulative behaviors that feel increasingly out of sync with the image they've constructed. The therapist becomes aware of subtle shifts, moments where the persona falters, revealing glimpses of the fragile, disorganized self beneath. This is where projective identification comes into play. Kernberg emphasized how narcissists project their own unmanageable feelings, rage, inadequacy, emptiness, onto others, particularly those in close proximity. In therapy, this might look like the patient blaming the therapist for their emotional pain, or subtly coercing the therapist into feeling inadequate, confused, or devalued. These dynamics are not intentional. They are unconscious defenses deployed to avoid psychological collapse. At this stage, exposure is not public scandal, but private unraveling. The narcissist begins to lose the capacity to uphold their own narrative. The lies they tell themselves no longer protect them from internal chaos. Their projections miss the mark. Their manipulations fail. And crucially, their therapist stops being seduced by the grandiose self. This is the first act of clinical clarity. The therapist begins to name what is happening. They interpret, gently and firmly, the mechanisms at play. The narcissist begins to hear, for perhaps the first time, the reflection of a reality they have avoided their entire life. This isn't strength, it's defense. This isn't love, it's control. And in the moments that follow, the therapeutic process becomes sacred. Because from that point on, the work is not about fixing surface behavior. It's about dismantling an entire psychological edifice that has been built in fear. The narcissist is not merely exposed, they are seen. And being seen, truly seen, can be the beginning of transformation. This exposure is not an end, it is a painful grace. It opens the door to everything that follows. The loss of omnipotent control, the collapse of illusions, the slow birth of a real integrated self. Loss of omnipotent control. Kernberg emphasizes the importance of confronting the patient's omnipotent defenses. These are not just attitudes. They are deep, rigid, and pathological structures developed in early childhood to avoid psychic annihilation. The narcissist does not merely believe they are superior. They must be superior in order to survive psychologically. Without omnipotence, the narcissist believes they will disintegrate. This need for control shows up in therapy in many forms: interrupting interpretations, reframing the therapist's words to maintain dominance, or using charm, intimidation, or intellectualization to steer the process away from vulnerability. The patient may respond to challenges with grandiosity or even threaten to quit therapy when their authority is questioned. These moments are not incidental. They are expressions of the narcissistic structure itself resisting change. Therapy becomes a battleground of sorts, but not of hostility. It is a battle between fantasy and reality, between the need to control and the opportunity to heal. And when the therapist holds the therapeutic frame with firmness and empathy, something begins to happen. The narcissist realizes they cannot manipulate their way to emotional safety. They cannot control the therapeutic space. They cannot manipulate the therapist. They cannot escape interpretation. They cannot avoid the truth of their emotional world. This is where the real suffering begins. Because for the pathological narcissist, the loss of control is experienced as ego death. They may spiral into panic or rage, reacting as though their very survival is at stake. This reaction is not dramatized. It is real, rooted in the early developmental trauma that shaped the narcissistic personality. What Kernberg shows us is that this loss of omnipotent control, though terrifying, is a critical moment in therapy. It marks the beginning of differentiation between the false self and the true self. The patient begins to understand that the grandiose self is a defense, not an identity. That vulnerability is not annihilation, but humanity. And yet, the process is far from linear. After the initial breach in omnipotence, the narcissist may retaliate with increased efforts to regain control. They may idealize the therapist one week and devalue them the next. They may intellectualize feelings to escape them or attempt to turn the therapy into a performance. But if the therapist remains attuned, honest, and consistent, the therapeutic alliance becomes a space where the narcissist can begin to relinquish the illusion of omnipotence. They begin, tentatively, to tolerate not being in control, to experience the world without domination, to feel shame without collapse, to feel love without manipulation. This is not just behavioral change, it is existential shift. Because when a person who has depended on control their entire life learns to sit with uncertainty, to risk being known, to exist without superiority, they are not just changing, they are healing. Isolation of the grandiose self. As defenses collapse, so too does the narcissist's relational web. Those who once admired them begin to drift. Colleagues, friends, even family members withdraw, confused and hurt by repeated emotional injuries. Kernberg describes how the grandiose self depends on external validation to survive. Without a mirror, the narcissist begins to fade. Isolation sets in. And with isolation comes either insight or deeper pathology. But this isolation is more than physical solitude. It is a collapse of narcissistic supply, the feedback loop that sustained their illusion of superiority. Without the constant reinforcement of their grandiosity, the narcissist begins to unravel. What remains is not a refined self in solitude, but a fractured self struggling to maintain coherence. This is often the stage when narcissists feel most desperate. They may attempt to reconnect with past sources of admiration, launch dramatic gestures, or seek new relationships where they can resume their performance. But the results are different now. What once worked no longer does. The charm falls flat. The manipulation is transparent. The old narratives no longer hold. The world around them has changed, but so has the internal structure. The isolation is not simply from others, but from the fantasy of the omnipotent self. The patient is alone with what remains. The unhealed wounds, the vulnerable core, the childlike longing for unconditional love. And this moment, as painful and confusing as it is, marks a profound therapeutic opportunity. For the first time, the narcissist may be able to feel what they have defended against their entire lives: abandonment, rejection, insignificance. And if the therapist can hold this space without judgment, it becomes possible to help the patient process these feelings without collapsing into shame or rage. Kernberg saw isolation not as punishment, but as a necessary condition for therapeutic truth. It is the emptying of the stage, the turning off of the spotlight, the moment when the actor is left without a script. In that silence, something real can finally speak. But this stage is also fragile. The narcissist may respond with regression, clinging to any form of control they can find. They may idealize the therapist, or swing into devaluation if their vulnerability is not perfectly mirrored. This is where the therapeutic frame must remain strong. The therapist must resist being drawn into rescue fantasies or colluding with the patient's illusions. If held correctly, the isolation deepens into reflection. The patient begins to see their impact on others, to experience loneliness not as an attack, but as a signal of disconnection. Empathy may stir, remorse may surface, and from that quiet center, a new foundation of identity can slowly be built, one not forged in applause, but in authenticity. Isolation is not the end. It is a portal, a necessary interruption, a sacred pause. In the narcissist's story of invulnerability, it is the first true moment of human vulnerability. And if they remain in that space, with support, with honesty, with courage, it can become the most important chapter of their healing journey. Fragmentation and the return of the real self. When the false self is no longer sufficient to regulate the narcissist's identity, fragmentation begins. This is not a gentle unraveling. It is a violent collapse of the internal structures that once kept the narcissist emotionally afloat. Kernberg described this stage as one of intense psychic turmoil, where the internal world, once divided, split, and tightly managed, becomes chaotic. Contradictory self-images begin to emerge. The grandiose self no longer has the power to suppress the hated self, the abandoned child self, the empty and shame-filled core. These selves, long buried under layers of defense, surge forward in waves of anxiety, depression, confusion, and despair. This process can be terrifying for the patient. They may feel as though they are going mad. They may not know who they are without the identity constructed through control and admiration. The therapist may witness sudden mood swings, intense emotional dysregulation, and episodes of self-directed rage or dissociation. It is crucial in this moment that the therapist remains grounded, providing a stable mirror that does not fragment in response. The fragmentation stage is where the deepest work begins. It is the ground zero of transformation. The task is no longer about confronting defenses. It is about creating a space where the real self, the previously disowned and shamed parts of the patient, can begin to speak. Often these parts emerge through vulnerability, tearful disclosures, quiet confessions of worthlessness, or long-suppressed memories of childhood pain and unmet needs. In Kernberg's model, the therapist must hold an integrative stance, acknowledging the reality of the patient's destructiveness while simultaneously affirming their capacity for healing. Interpretation at this stage is not about confrontation, but containment. The therapist becomes the witness to the patient's psychic wreckage and the guide toward reintegration. This process is slow. The narcissist may regress, attempt to reconstitute the grandiose self, or try to escape through new forms of external validation. But if the therapeutic relationship remains consistent, if it holds firm without judgment, the patient may gradually come to see that they can survive without the mask, that they can feel shame and still be seen, that they can be flawed and still be loved. The return of the real self is not an event. It is a slow awakening. The patient begins to speak in their own voice, not in rehearsed lines. They begin to feel without needing to control. They become curious about their impact on others. They express needs without manipulation. These moments are often quiet, even awkward, because they are new. And though these first glimpses of authenticity may be fleeting, they are sacred. Because in a personality structure defined by illusion, even a moment of reality is a victory. Even a crack in the mask is a miracle. This is the place where the narrative shifts from pathology to possibility, where healing does not erase the past, but reclaims it, where the narcissist becomes human again, fragile, complex, real, rage, regression, and the temptation of splitting. The narcissist's most powerful defense is splitting, dividing people, emotions, and experiences into all good or all bad. When exposed, they may rage against the therapist. When isolated, they may seek new sources of admiration to restore the fantasy. This is where therapy is most at risk. The patient may devalue the therapist, idealize another, or drop out of treatment altogether. But if the therapeutic alliance holds, if the therapist can withstand the storm, then something new can emerge, the capacity to hold ambivalence, to feel love and hate together, to be both flawed and worthy. This is the heart of Kernberg's insight. Real change occurs not by removing pathology, but by integrating it into a coherent sense of self. Shame as the catalyst for growth. Eventually, shame arrives. Not the shame projected outward, but internalized shame. The patient sees themselves not as they wish to be, but as they are, wounded, reactive, and deeply afraid. This shame is unbearable without support. But in the therapeutic space, with empathy and interpretation, shame becomes transformative. The patient begins to feel remorse. They express regret. They try to repair. And in this fragile, uncertain moment, they take their first steps toward authenticity. Not all will continue. Many regress. Some will flee. But for those who stay, this shame becomes the doorway to emotional maturity. Reconstruction of the self through therapy. Once fragmentation has occurred and the real self begins to emerge, the process of reconstruction can finally begin. This phase is delicate, vulnerable, and unlike the dramatic unraveling that preceded it, it is defined by subtleties, new behaviors, unfamiliar emotions, and moments of quiet integration. Otto Kernberg's work emphasizes that reconstruction is not simply about repairing damage. It is about rebuilding identity from the ground up, this time on the foundation of truth. The reconstructed self is not the restoration of the grandiose image. Rather, it is the birth of a new internal structure, an identity that can hold complexity, tolerate imperfection, and function without domination or deceit. The therapeutic task shifts from confronting pathology to nurturing growth. This requires a reorganization of how the patient relates to themselves and others. Emotional regulation must be learned where manipulation once stood. Empathy must be cultivated where exploitation once prevailed. Boundaries must be respected, both given and received. For the narcissist, These are not minor adjustments. They are radical shifts in psychic architecture. In this phase, therapy becomes about practice. The patient learns how to express disappointment without collapsing into rage, how to experience love without control, how to acknowledge guilt without spiraling into shame. Each session becomes a rehearsal space for life lived authentically. The therapist's role evolves as well, from interpretive mirror to relational partner. Attunement remains crucial, but so does accountability. The therapist must celebrate progress while still naming patterns that threaten to pull the patient back into illusion. Hope is introduced not as a fantasy, but as a practice. The slow cultivation of a life built on integrity. One of the most powerful signs of reconstruction is the emergence of gratitude, not the manipulative, performative gratitude of the false self, but a deep, sincere awareness of the therapeutic journey. Patients may begin to thank the therapist not for rescuing them, but for staying, for telling the truth, for bearing witness to their pain when no one else could. This gratitude often extends inward. The patient begins to appreciate their own strength, their courage, their capacity to feel, to change, to become. What once felt like a collapse now looks like a beginning. And this shift, from survival to sovereignty, is the essence of healing. Conclusion: the redemption of the self. In Kernberg's view, the path out of narcissistic pathology is not paved with shame, but with structure, with consistency, with courageous truth-telling, and with a therapeutic relationship strong enough to survive what the patient could not. The road is long. The pain is real. But so is the possibility. To those walking this road, or guiding others along it, hold steady. The false self may dominate for a season, but it cannot reign forever. Truth will always outlast illusion. Love, when honest and enduring, reshapes even the most disordered soul. If you found value in this exploration of Kernberg's model and the redemptive work of narcissistic transformation, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into personality theory, clinical wisdom, and psychological healing. Thank you for watching. Let the work continue. Let the healing begin.